I look back to ancient Kemet and I seen karate, when I seen the depictions of martial arts, to me at first it was just like, well, okay, wow, this stuff was here so long ago. We thought it came from the Orient, came from, the Asians, but here it is in ancient Kemet, old. And to my knowledge, there isn't any depictions of martial arts that predate what we find in ancient Kemet, which we can find going back to 3000 BCE. So unless somebody can produce anything that shows that they had these particular skills and was putting stuff out before then to us, the Egyptians came up with it. They developed the techniques or what have you. But from looking at it, you would just think, hey, this is about, self-defense, martial arts protection, Kemet always was under threat at some point in time. But when you go back 3000 BCE, it wasn't too much problems that you would think they would need to develop such a, technique and a strategy. So in looking at it on the surface, I was thinking, okay, well, this is the purpose, this is what it was for. But as I have explained and showed you guys, the ancient Egyptians knew the body. They knew about the mind. They knew all of this stuff, and they put it in so many different things. Now, I have talked to you about how hip hop music, how we have the subliminal message, how we have the controlling of our minds and music, and how music affects the brain. I've talked about this countless times and will continue to talk about it. But you have to understand that the ancient Egyptians already knew about it. They understood how music affects the brain. So when you see ancient Egyptian depictions of music bands, them playing musical instruments, we would call it today classical music, developing the mind, stimulating the mind, as I talked about. When you see depictions of them dancing, singing, we would call this stuff, ballet. R&B or soul or whatever. We will call it what we call it. But to them, this was just natural. So when you see these depictions of dancing and, and singing and bands playing and all kinds of stuff that we look at today and we take an entertainment value from it. And we look to ancient Kemet and we would think the same, but it's a lot more to it that the ancient Egyptians understood, and they knew how to get everything out of it. So when we look at, martial arts, when we look at this stuff, these depictions, and we say that, this stuff is martial arts, we think about Kung Fu, we think about karate or what have you, when we see these depictions, but to them, it wasn't such. Of course, they didn't use those names, but the ancient Egyptians understood the movement. They understood what the stuff was really about and what it would do. They understood that these movements not only, strengthened the muscles, but it sharpened the mind. These movements allow energy to flow through the body, to flow in different parts of the body. Different movements just loosen up the body and allow energy to flow, so you can feel energy flowing freely through different parts of the body. And this is one of the main reasons why they did it. It not only, helped sharpen the mind, help you connect muscle memory to, cognitive memory to your consciousness, but it also helped with meditation. It also helped you strengthen the muscles so you can sit in the lotus position, a meditative state, for long periods of time. So when you look at the ancient Egyptians and understand that they had basically what we call classical music, as I said, develops the brain, stimulates the brain, makes you smarter, makes you retain more knowledge. They understood this. When you look at the depictions and see that they had forms of ballet that help with movement, grace, something that help you develop energy-wise. All these things that we see that we find today in our society that we look at too as being refined, showing that these people have class, that they are of a high status because they, partake in such events. So as I talked about in the calculated destruction of the black man and woman, about how they got all dressed up and fancy and went to watch people, put on tutus and do ballet and, play classical music or what have you. This was because they associated these things with, wealth, refinement, or what have you. And many of the people there had absolutely no clue that this stuff goes back to energy, consciousness, and that it's going to develop you better in these areas and help stimulate you. So they basically took the good things from us, from ancient Kemet, the things that will help us develop and stimulate us spiritually and physically. They took these things out of ancient Kemet, kept them for themselves, told us nothing about it. We just watched and wondered, like, what are these crazy people doing? Took it for themselves. We were stuck to, just develop jazz, the blues, singing about our sorrows and pain. But when you go to ancient Kemet and look at martial arts, they call it Lotus fighting, which we understood how important the Lotus was to ancient Kemet. It symbolized rebirth with the opening of the petals when the sun rises and the closing of the petals at night. They related it to the sun, of course, which the sun was revered. When you look at it in Buddhism, of course, the same thing. The Lotus symbolized spiritual awakening and purity, because you had a lotus, which is also called a water lily, which basically sprang up, from the dirt, the dirty water, from the water, what have you, and came out and, opened up perfectly clean, pure, no dirt, no mud, no soot, or nothing on the petals. It always sprang and opened up clean and clear. And the Buddhists looked at it as, the lotus made a conscious decision to basically say, I'm not going to get dirty. I'm going to come up, I'm going to be clean, I'm going to be pristine, in good condition, and I'm going to show off. And this is how, the Buddhists looked at it, so they associated with spiritual enlightenment, the lotus, which is why Buddha, you always see him sitting on top of the lotus in the lotus position, which is why they call it that, because they associate meditation, of course, with spiritual enlightenment, as well as the lotus. And we see, as I talked about before in Buddhism, how it goes hand in hand with Osiris and the lotus, and, Shiva and what have you, everything we find with the lotus. So you have to think about, ancient India, trading, and what was going on around that time. Now, we know they had Heraclion, which sank, the whole city I talk about that Frank Gaudio discovered, Heraclion that sank, and this was a huge trading port that so many civilizations came in and out and did trade. We talked about in Ancient History Part 1 about Tyre, about how, the Phoenicians did trade there, and how another huge trade port. But when you look at where India is and think about so much of the trade going on in those two places, and, of course, in India, they wasn't going to take that long, camel caravan ride all the way up to Tyre or Heraclion to do trades. So they had to sail across, which was a lot easier, into Ethiopia, and vice versa. The Africans sailed into India to do trade. Now, when you look at, the map, and you understand, of course, we have the Nile. We have the Nile all up and down the Nile. You had little trade ports there, and people that traded up and down the Nile. And when you pay attention, you have the Nile coming down into northern Sudan. And it basically separates, like right at the middle part of Sudan, and you have it going one way towards Ethiopia. It basically goes into Ethiopia and curls up into Axum. And you have the Blue Nile there. That's the Blue Nile that curls up into Axum in Ethiopia. Then it keeps going south, and you have the White Nile. But the Nile definitely went into Ethiopia with the Blue Nile. You have there one of the greatest African civilizations right off the Nile. You have the Axumite Empire, another African civilization where you had African kings and rulers that ruled there, and they had a thriving port there and a thriving civilization right off the Nile that a lot of people have no clue about. Now, we're going to get into this history because it's very important. Now, it basically goes with everything anyway. It's one of the things a lot of people don't understand about the connection between Africa and Rome, and how you can see how they was coming into Africa a lot and doing things. This is completely hidden from history, and it's stuff that they just don't talk about, because when you understand history, it's like, what the fuck was Rome doing? It's how you can see who's in power and who was doing what when you understand about these African empires that once existed. So we're going to talk about this because it fits and it goes in, with the line of history. So understand, one, when you talk about the Axumite Empire, we're talking about, these are the kings that they call Negus. When you hear people refer to kings as Negus, the black African kings, this was in Ethiopia. So you had this whole empire last from about the 1st century AD up until like the 4th century AD, I believe, or the 10th century AD, I should say. And it lasts for a long time. This was a thriving area. It was once part of the Kushite Empire at one time, and it separated, and you have this huge thriving empire that Rome knows a lot about. So you had the King Izana, basically convert the civilization to Christianity. Now we have correspondence between Constantine and King Izana. Constantine calling him his brother, his friend. So we have letters that they wrote, correspondence between each other with them being on good terms. Now I have a lot of knowledgeable Christians, the ones who know some things, who think I don't know anything. I have it's a lot of debates I do behind the scenes that you guys don't know. People don't want to do it, video wise or, publicly. They want to do it in messages or what have you. But I have had quite a few people bring up King Izana as far as giving validity to the Ethiopian Bible and giving validity to somehow the Africans developing Christianity in the Bible. The problem is when you get a person who does actual research, one of the things that this land is famous for, the Axumite Empire is famous for, is its obelisks. They have a bunch of obelisks there and a bunch of stelas there showing the connection to Nubia and ancient Kemet. So we find stelas in Nubia, we find obelisks in ancient Kemet. We know that they came down. The knowledge right there flows right into their land. Obviously, the ancient Egyptians was coming down and trading. We know about the connections between them all. So you have the ancient Egyptian influence with these obelisks and these stelas in Ethiopia and the Axumite Empire before, King Izana converted to Christianity. The knowledge was lost and there was no real connection to the understanding of what was going on back then and what the connection was with ancient Kemet. So you had this king come about and convert to Christianity, most likely for political reasons or political gain or what have you. And that's what happened. And when you put in, Constantine into the mix, you can see exactly what it was. But you have, for centuries, the Romans, which the Romans used Axumus as a trade port, a trade route. They basically did a lot of trade out of that port. This is why Constantine and King Izana was so cool, because he allowed them to do a lot of business there. So understand that. So we understand that they took, so many artifacts from out of there. We have in 1932, you have Rome basically come in there and pick up one of the obelisks, that they knocked down a long time ago. I showed you the pictures that they was just pulling down. They came in there and it was pulling down the obelisk to basically try to hide the connection with ancient Kemet. And they came in Axumus and pulled down a lot of these stelas and a lot of the obelisks, and they broke. A lot of them broke, when they came down. So you had in 1932 Rome come in there and basically pick up the pieces of one and take it back to Rome. So when you go into Britain, when you go into a lot of these museums, you find a lot of ancient Egyptian artifacts, a lot of African artifacts, because the Brits, you have the Romans, you have a lot of these civilizations, these people coming into African civilizations, ancient civilizations, and stealing artifacts. If it wasn't for people like Richard Pankhurst, who basically leads a team who goes into a lot of these countries and try to get the artifacts back, the Ethiopians wouldn't have gotten back the obelisk from Rome. They got it back in 2005 because they led a team and did a lot of lobbying to get that obelisk returned back to the Ethiopians. In 2005, they got it returned back. A lot of people don't even have a clue that Rome attacked Ethiopia, that Rome and Ethiopia went to war. People don't remember that Rome used chemical weapons on Ethiopia. This was around the time that Haile Selassie was in power, and he went to the United Nations and complained about it. So when people start talking about this Ethiopian Bible and Ethiopian creating Christianity or what have you, they don't know their damn history. They don't know what they're talking about. You have to go back and look at what was going on back then to understand that the Romans was coming in there for hundreds of years, for a long time, destroying shit, stealing artifacts. They pulled down a lot of those obelisks, the one they could pull down. They stole one, And this is what has been going on in so many different places in Africa. The reason why this history is important because it establishes a connection between, India coming into Ethiopia. When we look at those trade routes and understand that the Egyptians was coming down the Nile, that the Indians was coming over into Ethiopia, and they was trading right there. So a lot of people, when they look at India, they don't look at India and think about martial arts. And that's crazy because India has a very ancient history, still to this day, going back with martial arts. We find unbelievable skills. When you think about kickboxing, remember first, you had the people migrate over into India before they even got into Thailand, before they became the Thai people. They was in India first. So, which is why we see India taking Buddhism over to Asia, and India taking kickboxing, the fighting techniques into Thailand. So you got to think about that. A lot of people always don't make that connection. When you look at Thai, it is a lot of Indian tradition mixed up in there. When you travel a lot, you see it. When you go back and forth to both places, you can see the mix. You see the elephant a lot. We understand the symbolism behind a lot of these things. But a lot of people don't make that connection with martial arts in India. And they have a history that goes back, past 1000 BCE with martial arts when you look at the Vedas. And the Vedas is basically like the ancient history of Indian literature, put right there. You have the Vedas talking about, martial arts, talking about fighting techniques. You have the Dharma Veda, which translates into the science of archery, where you have them do techniques with the bow and other techniques using other weapons and, martial arts, combat skills or what have you. You have also Malayada, which translates into combat wrestling. And we know how important combat wrestling was, and wrestling was in ancient Kemet, what we talked about before with the Egyptians holding wrestling competitions with the Nubians. So we have Dharma Veda, which goes into the science of archery and the military science of India. You have Malayada, which deals with combat wrestling. And we can see in ancient Kemet clearly, they used the bow. We can see about combat wrestling. We can see how all this stuff, corresponds with each other, how we find it in the civilizations in ancient Kemet and in India. So it's not a coincidence that we find wrestling in ancient India and we find wrestling in ancient Kemet and Nubia, what have you, because they share a lot of the same spiritualities and practices and what have you. So now we have Bodh Dharma. And a lot of people don't know about Bodh Dharma unless you really get into Buddhism. And Bodh Dharma, which a lot is not known about his young life. He's believed to be a prince, son of an Indian king. And Bodh Dharma was a Buddhist monk. Bodh Dharma is considered basically the first Chinese patriarch because he's credited with bringing not only Chan Buddhism into China, but being one of the forefathers of Shaolin Kung Fu. The monks there could not meditate for long periods of time without falling asleep. So Bodh Dharma, understanding and having the techniques and knowledge about meditation, but you see how all this stuff goes back to energy, frequency, vibration, exactly what we were just talking about. So you have what meditation. You have japa meditation, which japa meditation is basically when you meditate with music, with chanting, with mantras. So while you are in the meditative position, you basically hum or sing a mantra of something that you wish to obtain, something you're trying to do. And you will hum this mantra, put this mantra out as a song. Because remember, we're talking about music and stimulation. This has to do with vibration and frequency. So while you humming and singing this mantra, you basically run your hand across each mala bead. And you see a lot of times where Buddhist monks carrying the mala beads or the beads, you see, they carry the beads and what have you. Now the thing is, the mala beads, it's 108 beads on that mala. On the mala bead. 108. You can count them for yourself. Trust me, it's 108. We know, if you've seen Frequency DVD, we know 108 translates into 9. Now also, when you go to the Shaolin Temple, when you go to the Tibetan temples, the Buddhist temples or what have you in Tibet and Thailand, it's 108 steps. 108 steps. We've seen a lot of times, look at the pictures, you see that it's always all these stairs leading up to these temples. Trust me, I know I had to climb when I was in Thailand up to the temple in the sky. If you look at my intro on the video, I think right before one of the last videos is me. It's in the temple in the sky in Thailand. So you go up a lot of steps, 108 steps to get up there to these temples. So again, 108 translates into 9. Another thing, when you look at the 108 auspicious symbols on the bottom of Buddha's feet. Auspicious basically means, promising, favorable. So you have the 108 auspicious symbols on the bottom of Buddha's feet. When I went to Thailand, again, I took the picture with the Buddha statue for a reason. I took a picture by his feet for a reason because I understood what was on the bottom of his feet, which I also clearly took a picture of that. And you have these 108 symbols again. 108 equals 9. Here we have again that number 9 being really important. When you read about the 108 auspicious symbols on the bottom of Buddha's feet, and then you begin to understand the meaning of 108. Same thing in ancient Kemet, when you understand the meaning of 108 and you understand about the frequency and the vibration, the 432 and the 108 and the 54, with the pyramids, and you understand how it corresponds with reality and frequency and vibration and sound and what have you. I mean, all this stuff, when you actually can go there and listen to the acoustics, the sound in the pyramids, and start making these connections and putting this stuff together, it becomes so much more real within your consciousness. So we have the 108 beads on the mala beads. We have the 108 auspicious symbols on Buddha. We have the 108 steps. So you understand when you have the 108 symbols on the bottom of Buddha's feet and you have the 108 steps, how it all corresponds with each other. You begin to understand it's the 216, which we know we can get from the 216. We can break it down and still give us 9. It's so deep how it all comes together. You also have the 108 temptations they talk about in Buddhism in Japan. And, the new year or, every year they ring the bell 108 times in the Buddhist temples in Japan to symbolize those 108 temptations that you're supposed to overcome in order to reach nirvana. So, and this stuff just goes deep. When you start finding, the numerology fitting in with martial arts and fitting in with Buddhism and the understanding of these things, you start to bring it all together and understand we're talking about the same stuff here, people. The same family. It's all fit together and it's giving you the information in so many different forms that's really going back to one thing with frequency and vibration, which is you. Now, you also have 108 pressure points in the body, depending on who you speak to, but most people agree on that 108 number. And then you have the Goju Ryu katas. You have these martial arts katas that the Chinese and the Japanese deal with. It's a huge thing when you start getting into martial arts. So you have the Goju Ryu katas, which in Japanese you have the Goju Yanho kata, which translates into the 54 steps, which 5 and 4 give you 9. You also have, in China, you have the Super Rinpe Shaw, which translates into the 108 hands. Now, these katas, when you look at the Super Rinpe, these katas they're ancient one, and they're important to developing in any type of skill. And you have these base moves that if you can perform them, it basically says a lot about the level you are at. When you start to look at a lot of the many techniques in martial arts, you're going to always find 108. I'm not going to go through them all, but I promise you in every single one, 108 is in there. But when you look at, the many styles and understand, what the stuff is going back to as far as developing spiritually. They had so many different styles that basically came about after Kung Fu, kickboxing and everything else, Kung Fu and, Wing Chun and karate or what have you. All these different styles and techniques that we later get. So you had back then, you had all these different schools springing up with different fighting styles. And a lot of you people probably seen a lot of the old Kung Fu movies that used to come on when you was younger. And remember how it was. It was always different schools being set up, different styles of fighting, and it was all about whose style was the best. If you opened up another school that taught the same technique as another school that was across the way, they would have competitions. But they still would always have competitions to see, what school was the best, what style was the best. And the thing with these styles and techniques, see, when they took these styles and start developing these styles off of, a Shaolin Kung Fu. Remember, you got to understand, this is a huge thing right here that a lot of people don't understand, but Bruce Lee did, which we'll get into.